The sun set slowly, tinting the sky gold and orange, while the small wooden table trembled in the street wind. On it lay only a few dry breadcrumbs, scattered like forgotten dust. The bright-eyed black girl bent over the empty plate and began arranging each piece as if they were exquisite dishes. To anyone passing by, it seemed like a game, but to her, it was survival. With her tiny fingers, she placed a larger crumb in the center, calling it roast chicken. Smaller crumbs were golden potatoes. A barely visible fragment became dessert. Her imagination filled not only the plate, but also her heart with silent hope. She smiled to herself, as if she were truly facing a feast. As I chewed slowly, I closed my eyes and created flavors in my mind. The dry taste of the crumbs transformed into broths, spices, and succulent meats that existed only within her. Each bite was an act of resistance against the reality that wanted to remind her of her hunger. For the girl, imagining was the only way to avoid the ache growing in her empty stomach. The scene was so delicate that, for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The wind held its breath. The noisy street, filled with honking horns and hurried footsteps, seemed to fall silent before that solitary choreography. A child reinvented the world with only what she had left. Scraps. And yet, there was a dignity in the way she lifted her chin and chewed slowly. Her clothes were worn, stitched in different shades, as if each patch were a memory. On her feet, mismatched shoes, one larger than the other, made each step seem like a challenge. Yet she stood erect. It was as if silently saying, "You will not see my hunger defeat me." With each crumb, a ritual. She picked it up delicately, looked at it as if it were something precious, and only then put it in her mouth. Her stomach growled loudly, but she responded with a contrived smile. That little act was more than a game. It was emotional survival, a silent cry to the world that passed by unnoticed. Meanwhile, expensive cars cruised down the street, kicking up dust, reflecting headlights against the asphalt wet from the afternoon rain. Inside, the windows were closed and hurried glances never lingered on the scene. The contrast between the luxury that passed by and the girl who remained created an invisible tension, as if two worlds touched but did not mix. Her breathing quickened between bites, as if she were running a marathon just to keep from collapsing. Her watery eyes held no tears. There was too much pride to allow that. The silence of the street, mixed with the distant sound of laughter in brightly lit restaurants, made the imaginary feast even more intense. A stray dog approached, sniffing the plate. The girl smiled and shared a crumb with him, extending her hand affectionately. Even with what little she had, there was room to share. The animal wagged its tail and lay down beside her, as if guarding the dignity she insisted on carrying. And it was at that moment, with the last crumb touching her lips, that a distant gaze met hers. Across the street, a man in a luxury car held his breath. His heart, accustomed to the cold steel of business, beat differently. Because in that simple gesture, in that improbable scene, there was something no banquet worth millions had ever shown her. The raw truth of life. The tinted windows of the luxury car slowly rolled down, revealing the face of a middle-aged man, impeccably dressed. His eyes were trained in numbers, contracts, and figures, but for some reason that night, he couldn't look away from the scene before him. The girl, eating crumbs as if they were a feast, pierced his decades-old emotional armor. He was a billionaire accustomed to dinners in gilded halls, where bottles of wine cost more than an entire family's home. But there, across the street, a child was transforming nothing into everything. The sight pierced him like an invisible blade. His heart, heavy and accustomed to indifference, wavered as if it had forgotten its own rhythm. For a moment, he considered simply speeding up and leaving. It was what he always did. Close his eyes, not get involved, stay away from other people's pain. But something about the scene held his attention. Maybe it was the way she lifted her chin, as if refusing to be, defeated. Or maybe it was because, somewhere in the back of his mind, he'd seen that same look before. The silence inside the car contrasted with the noise of the city outside. The engine roared softly, but the man heard nothing but the muted sound of the girl's imaginary chewing. He felt small, ridiculously small in front of a child who possessed more courage than any businessman he had ever met. His fingers tightened nervously on the leather steering wheel. That simple gesture from a child moved him more than millions lost on the stock market. For the first time in years, tears threatened. He hadn't cried since childhood, when hunger had also been his silent companion. The contrast was overwhelming. Inside the car, the smell of new leather, expensive fragrances, the comfort of air conditioning. Outside, dust, icy wind, and the girl's unstable desk. Two worlds separated by a glass that suddenly seemed like a wall between abundance and scarcity. A memory of a recent banquet came to mind. A 20-seat table, plates being cleared away while still full, guests laughing loudly, waiters rushing to replace untouched glasses. In that moment, he felt ashamed, because now he saw what he never wanted to see. That blind abundance is also a form of poverty. A security guard in the front seat noticed his boss's gaze and asked if he should continue. The billionaire, still engrossed in the scene, didn't respond. He simply raised his hand, asking for silence, as if he didn't want the moment to be interrupted. That girl with her feast of crumbs had become the center of an entire universe. He knew he could simply look away as always. But something in his soul had already been touched. A crack opened in his armor, revealing a heart that still beat. And for the first time in a long time, he asked himself, what's the point of having everything if I can't see the value in the little? The car remained stationary, the man motionless, and the city continued its indifferent flow. But within that moment he knew something had changed forever. Because it wasn't just a girl pretending to feast, it was he who, for the first time in years, felt hungry, not for food, but for real. The billionaire opened the car door, and the sound of traffic hit him like a wave, but he didn't care. His expensive shoes touched the damp asphalt, clashing with the dust of the street. He walked slowly, as if each step weighed more than his own fortune. His gaze fixed on the girl guided him, and nothing else seemed to exist around him. The child continued her ritual of faking flavors, oblivious to the world passing by. When she noticed the shadow cast across the table, she looked up. She found a man with teary eyes, a rare sight in adults. She didn't understand why he looked so shaken, but she recognized something familiar in his gaze. Loneliness. His heart felt like it was exploding in his chest. Decades of business, power, and luxury hadn't prepared him for that encounter. Every crumb the girl brought to her mouth was a reminder of his own hungry childhood. He felt a sharp pain, as if he were a boy again, sitting in an empty kitchen, waiting for a meal that never arrived. His hands trembled, and for a moment he considered hiding his tears, maintaining his image as an unshakable man. But it was useless. The scene was so pure it dismantled any defenses. He brought his hand to his face, as if trying to hold back the tears, but he couldn't. Thick tears ran down, falling onto the gray street. The girl looked at him silently, not fully understanding. But there was something respectful in her gaze. She didn't mock, she wasn't frightened. She just observed, as if she recognized in that man something broken, as fragile as she was, and that for him was even more painful. Realizing that it wasn't just the girl who was vulnerable, he knelt beside the table, oblivious to the dirt on the sidewalk. His multi-million-dollar suit brushed the stained floor, and for once, he didn't care. The world around him might judge him, but here, before the girl and her feast of crumbs, the billionaire was no longer anything but a human being. Why do you smile like that?" he asked, his voice breaking. The girl shrugged, her composure unwavering. "Because it's what I have. And if I don't smile, I'll cry from hunger." Those words pierced his chest like an arrow. More than an imaginary feast, it was a philosophy of survival. He felt ashamed of his wasted banquets, of his lavish tables left untouched, ashamed of never having stopped to see who was truly hungry. There, sitting on the floor with a child, he understood that the cruelest misery was not hers, but his, the inability to see ahead. And if this scene has already touched your heart, imagine what's yet to come. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this story will take you even deeper. His breathing was heavy, almost like sobs. The security guards watched from afar, uncomfortable, not understanding what was happening. For them, it was unthinkable to see their powerful boss kneeling before a street girl, but for him, it was inevitable. It was as if his heart, locked away for so long, had finally broken its chains. That night, the billionaire returned to his mansion. Automatic gates opened, revealing a modern palace, lights reflecting off glass and marble walls. Everything seemed perfect, but the silence inside was deafening. No laughter, no smell of fresh food, just cold hallways, too vast for a single man to inhabit. He entered the dining room, where a long table stretched out as if awaiting dozens of guests. However, only one dish was served. The cook obediently prepared banquets even though he knew they would be served by a single person. The billionaire sat down, looked at the food before him, and suddenly remembered the girl's crumbs. The silver cutlery weighed heavily in his hands. He cut a piece of tender meat, but couldn't bring it to his mouth. The taste no longer mattered. His stomach might be full, but his heart was empty. The image of the child arranging pieces of bread as if they were delicacies returned with force, transforming each luxurious dish into something grotesque. The mansion's walls reflected his weary face. He saw there a man who had achieved everything and at the same time had lost his essence. The echo of his footsteps echoed through the hallways, reminding him that there was no one to share what he possessed. It was like living in an ice castle, beautiful on the outside but frozen on the inside. It was then that an old memory surfaced, vivid and painful. He found himself small again, sitting in a modest kitchen, waiting for his mother to return with some food. The clock ticked and his stomach growled. There were days when all they could find was a stale loaf of bread, broken into pieces to pretend it was enough for two. He remembered his mother's voice. "Never forget, son. Hunger teaches you more than any school." At that time, he swore he would never again experience scarcity. And he kept his promise, perhaps too much so. He fought, studied, became an entrepreneur, and built an empire. But in the process, he also buried the hungry child who still lived inside him. The billionaire raised his crystal glass, gazing at the wine reflecting the golden light. However, he didn't see wealth. He saw blood, waste, a purposeless luxury. The memory of the girl chewing on crumbs seemed to mock him. It was as if the universe had set an ambush to expose the contradiction of his life. He dropped his fork onto his plate. The metallic sound echoed through the empty room like a pent-up scream. For the first time, the billionaire realized that, despite all the feasting, he was still the same hungry boy. Only now, the hunger wasn't for bread. It was for meaning. His heart sank. The smell of food that used to whet his appetite now sickened him. He got up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Outside, he knew. Thousands were sleeping without dinner, while inside his house expensive dishes were left uneaten. In that instant, he understood. The girl hadn't just eaten crumbs. She had given him back a mirror. And in that reflection, he saw not a victor, but someone lost, who needed to rediscover the boy who had once hungered. Not for wealth, but for life. The next morning, the billionaire returned to the same street where he'd seen the girl. The sun was still rising, tinting the buildings orange, and the city was slowly waking up. He wasn't sure exactly why he was there. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a calling. But deep down, he knew. That child had stirred something he could no longer ignore. As he walked down the sidewalk, people eyed him suspiciously. His impeccable suit contrasted with the dust of the streets, and many wondered what a man like him was doing there. But he didn't care. The sound of horns, voices, and footsteps blended into a chaotic symphony, but his attention was fixed solely on finding the girl. It didn't take long for him to realize that not everyone welcomed his presence there. A shopkeeper, leaning against the store door, muttered, "Those kids are just a nuisance. They come begging. They litter the street. I don't know what you're looking for, but it's best not to get involved." The words, laden with coldness, struck the billionaire like a cruel sentence. Further on, a woman called out to him sarcastically, "If you want to help, give the city money to clean up this mess. Street children don't change." He felt his anger rise, but he held it in. He looked around and realized that the girl wasn't just invisible, she was unwanted. The whole society seemed to want to push her into the shadows. The silence he carried within himself was now crushed by these hostile voices. It was as if the world screamed at him to forget what he had seen, but deep down, something greater whispered, "Don't give up." He remembered the girl's smile, the dignity with which she had picked up her crumbs, and that was stronger than any venomous comment. His footsteps led him to the corner where he'd seen the child the night before. The makeshift table was still there, rickety and stained with age, but the girl wasn't. The emptiness of that space tightened his chest. It felt as if the ground had swallowed the only fragment of truth he'd found in years. He asked a few residents about the girl. Some said they'd never noticed her. Others pretended not to hear. Some even responded with irritation, as if it were absurd to pay attention to someone so small and unimportant. Each response was a blow, revealing how much the girl's life was ignored by everyone. In the midst of his frustration, he heard a street urchin murmur, "She comes back at night. During the day, she disappears somewhere." The billionaire thanked him and felt a sudden sense of relief. There was a chance he'd find her again. But with this relief came a sense of unease. How many more nights would she have to concoct feasts to stave off hunger? He sat on a nearby bench, determined to wait. Cars passed, dust rose, and the frenetic pace of the city surrounded him. But inside him, there was only silence and anticipation. The billionaire knew that this night would not be like any other. Something was about to change. Something the world was not ready to witness. And as the sun rose above the horizon, he realized that that street carried more than poverty. It carried the weight of a society that preferred to ignore the hungry to maintain its own clear conscience. But now he could no longer close his eyes, because he had seen it, and once you see it, there's no going back. Night fell, and the street once again filled with artificial lights and long shadows. The billionaire, sitting on the same bench since the afternoon, finally saw her. The girl emerged slowly, carrying a nearly empty plastic bag. Inside, only a loaf of stale bread and a few crusts. His heart raced. It was as if he were reunited with someone who held a key to his soul. He stood and walked toward her. The girl looked at him in surprise, recognizing him. Her eyes narrowed as if trying to understand what the man was still doing there. "You're back?" she asked suspiciously. The billionaire nodded, unsure of what to say. I want to be here with you." She arched her eyebrow, laughing briefly, almost ironically. "I don't need anyone. I've already learned how to manage myself." Calmly, she arranged her crumbs again on the table, repeating the same ritual as the night before. He watched every movement, enchanted and torn at the same time. Trying to help her, the billionaire took some bills from his pocket and placed them on the table. But the girl pushed the money back, firm and proud. "Money doesn't fill the plate. I've seen many people make promises, but they never change anything. I don't want that." Her words were sharp, and they hurt the man more than any public accusation. For a moment, he was paralyzed. No one had ever rejected him for having money. This child had just brutally exposed his powerlessness. He took a deep breath, swallowing his pride, and realized he couldn't simply solve this with wealth. He would need to earn something more difficult: trust. "So, what do you want?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. The girl smiled wistfully, looking up at the stars that barely showed in the polluted sky. "I want to believe I can still dream, but the world won't let me." The answer shattered him. It wasn't food. It wasn't money. It was hope. He stepped closer, trying to extend his hand, but the girl recoiled. "Don't come too close. I've been fooled before. They promise the world, but in the end, all that's left is emptiness." There was a premature hardness in her voice, as if she'd aged prematurely. It made his heart sink even more. A deep silence fell between them. Only the sound of strangers' hurried footsteps filled the night. The billionaire understood, for the first time, that wanting to help wasn't enough. He had to deserve it. And gaining that child's trust would be like climbing an impossible mountain. He sat beside the table, this time without saying a word. He simply watched the girl continue her feast of imagination. The simple act of remaining there, in silence, was already a choice, proving he wouldn't leave like everyone else. And as she bit into another crumb and closed her eyes to feign non-existent flavors, he realized something. The real resistance wasn't in her refusal, in accepting help. It was in the way she transformed nothingness into dignity, and that was something he could never buy, only learn. The billionaire leaned over the makeshift table again, still determined to break down the barrier between him and the girl. This time he brought with him a bag from a nearby bakery, filled with warm bread and fresh pastries. He placed them on the table with a generous, almost triumphant gesture, as if he had found the solution. The girl looked at the bread with attentive eyes, but instead of running to them, she crossed her arms. "Do you think this will solve the problem?" she asked firmly. The man was confused. He expected immediate gratitude, perhaps even tears, but instead he met resistance. "It's just today's food. What about tomorrow? Will it be here too?" Her words fell like stones. The billionaire didn't know how to respond immediately. He was used to solving problems with a snap of his fingers, a check, an order, an investment. But here, facing a street child, his power seemed ridiculously fragile. For the first time in years, he felt disarmed. "I don't want handouts," she continued, her voice firm. "I don't want to live waiting for someone rich to come along and save me. I want to be able to believe that tomorrow I'll eat because I deserve it, not because someone looked at me with pity." The billionaire swallowed hard, feeling the force of her words as if they were hammered into his conscience. He tried to argue, "But I can guarantee you'll never go hungry again." The girl shook her head impatiently. "You can guarantee food, but you can't give me dignity. Only I can build that." The clash between their worlds had never been so evident. On one side, boundless wealth. On the other, a child struggling to keep her honor intact. The silence between them grew heavy, almost suffocating. The billionaire realized that despite all his wealth, he hadn't learned how to deal with it. Pride, resilience, the raw truth. He wasn't facing a victim, but a silent warrior who preferred suffering to surrendering to pity. She took one of the loaves from the bag, but instead of eating it, she broke it into small pieces and began to arrange it on the table, as she did with the crumbs. The man watched, perplexed. Even when faced with abundance, she maintained the same ritual. It was as if to say, "It's not what's on my plate that defines me, but how I deal with it." "You're different from everyone I've ever met," the billionaire admitted, almost in a whisper. The girl looked up and replied, "I'm no different. I just didn't let the world break me." Those words echoed within him, awakening something buried since his forgotten childhood. At that moment, the billionaire realized that bringing food wasn't enough, nor even promises. He needed to learn from her. He needed to listen, because deep down she possessed what he had lost, the power to transform little into abundance. And that was true wealth. And there, at a table dimly lit by a streetlight, two worlds collided. He was no longer just a billionaire and a starving girl. They were two clashing philosophies of life, the man who had everything but felt nothing, and the child who had nothing but still found ways to smile. The billionaire took a deep breath, trying to compose himself after the shock of the girl's words. For the first time, he realized he needed to change the way he approached her. So, instead of insisting on the money or the bag of bread, he made a simple decision. He sat on the floor next to the unstable table, leveling himself with her. The girl watched him silently, intrigued. She was used to seeing men in suits hurrying past, always looking down. But this man now bent down, risking getting his expensive suit dirty, ignoring the curious glances around him. It was as if he wanted to say without words, "I'm here, just like you." He took a loaf of bread from the bag and broke it in half. Then he handed a piece to the girl without saying a word. The gesture was simple, almost childish, but it carried enormous weight. It wasn't alms, it wasn't a transaction. It was sharing. For the first time, he wasn't offering as if he had too much. He was offering as if he wanted to share. The girl hesitated. Her suspicious eyes scanned the outstretched hand. After a few seconds of silence, she took the bread and took a small, almost ceremonial bite. The man did the same with his half. There, in that shared chewing, something changed. For the first time, the two were truly connected. The billionaire tasted the plain bread as if it were a delicacy. There was no expensive wine or rare spices, but each piece seemed to fill not only his stomach, but the emptiness of his soul. He looked at the girl and realized that in that moment, he wasn't the one offering. He was the one receiving. The girl, still suspicious, chewed slowly, as if testing the limits of this strange gesture. But little by little, her expression relaxed. The hardness in her eyes gave way to a small spark of curiosity. Perhaps, she thought, this man was different from the others. Perhaps he wasn't. Just another one who would pass by and be forgotten. Across the street, people watched strangely. A famous billionaire sat on the ground, sharing bread with a child. Some laughed, some took pictures, some just looked away. But for the two of them, none of that mattered. It was as if the entire world had disappeared. The silence was comfortable. There were no speeches, no promises, just two human beings sharing the simplest food on earth. For the billionaire, this moment was a revelation. He had always believed that only luxury could bring value. Now he discovered that shared bread had more power than any banquet. When they finished eating, the girl looked at him with a serious expression. "That was different," she said softly. The man smiled, a shy, genuine smile, perhaps the first in many years. "Yes, it was," he replied, and they both knew they weren't just talking about the bread. They were talking about what had blossomed between them that night. And so, with a gesture as simple as breaking bread, two lives began to intertwine. There were no contracts, no written promises, just the most human act of all, sharing. And without realizing it, the billionaire had taken his first step toward a transformation that would change everything. The girl carefully brushed the crumbs from her plate, as if each grain were precious. The billionaire watched her silently, sensing that this small ritual hid something greater. When she finally looked up, she spoke softly, as if confessing a secret she'd kept deep in her soul. "My mother used to say we should never let hunger erase our dignity." The man leaned in to hear better. The words sounded like poetry to his ears, simple yet powerful. The girl repeated, "She said that even when our stomachs are screaming, we can't let our hearts be silent." The billionaire swallowed hard. This wasn't just a memory. It was an inheritance. "And where is your mother now?" he asked hesitantly. The girl sighed, staring into the empty street. "She's gone." There were no tears in her eyes, just a precocious hardness. "But she taught me to smile, even when I had nothing. Because smiling is the one thing no one can take away." The billionaire felt his chest tighten. He remembered his own mother, the words she'd also said on difficult days. "Never forget where you came from." Suddenly, two distant voices seemed to meet, bridging past and present. The mothers who shaped them, even in such different circumstances, now spoke through them. "She always made up stories for me at bedtime," the girl continued. "She said that one day I would have a table full of flowers and candles, and that I would laugh out loud without fear of tomorrow." The billionaire smiled sadly, because he had this table, flowers, candles, but no laughter. The cold night wind blew past, ruffling the girl's hair, and she closed her eyes for a moment. "You know, sometimes I think my mother is still around. When I laugh at my own jokes, I feel like she's smiling along with me." The man stood still. This wasn't just faith. It was survival through memory. He wanted to say something, but realized any words would be insufficient. So he just let the silence speak. A silence filled with respect, recognition, and shared pain. For the first time, he realized he wasn't the only one with hidden scars. The girl carried hers too, and she did. So, with more courage than he ever had, memories of the billionaire began to flood his mind. He saw his childhood, his absent father, his mother struggling to put food on the table. He saw himself promising himself he would never go hungry again. And, ironically, he realized he had kept that promise so obsessively that he had forgotten what truly mattered. When he looked back at the girl, she was still smiling, sorting through the remains of bread. My mother always said, "We may have nothing, but we never stop having everything if we know how to see." The phrase struck him like a revelation. It wasn't about the empty plate. It was about the eyes that saw abundance even in nothingness. And there, in the middle of the street lit by a solitary streetlight, the billionaire realized that girl wasn't just surviving. She was carrying a voice from the past, a wisdom that could change even the richest. Because sometimes poverty holds treasures that wealth can't buy. The billionaire took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to dive into an inner abyss. His eyes locked with the girl's, and he realized he could hide no longer. The words began to escape, trembling, as if they had been trapped for a long time. "You know, I've been hungry too." The girl stared at him in surprise, unblinking. For a moment she seemed in disbelief. How could a man dressed in a suit, surrounded by wealth, have known the same pain? He smiled wearily. "I grew up in a small house. Many nights, there was nothing, just the rumbling of an empty stomach." The memories flooded him so vividly it felt like he was there again. The dark kitchen, his mother trying to cover up the lack of food with made-up stories, the boy sitting, waiting, pretending to believe. "I promised myself I'd never feel that way again. I swore I'd win, no matter what." He closed his eyes as if the memories were burning. "And I won. I conquered money, power, houses, cars. But somehow, I still feel hungry. Not here." He pointed to his belly. "In here," and touched his chest. The simple gesture was enough for the girl to understand. His hunger was no longer for bread, but for meaning. The girl remained silent, watching him carefully. For the first time, she saw not just a rich man, but someone stripped of his armor. "You have everything," she said softly. "And yet, you miss it?" The billionaire nodded, his eyes welling up. "Yes, because what I lost can't be bought." The weight of those words hung in the air like an invisible burden. The billionaire realized he was confessing not only his pain, but also his loneliness. "I eat alone every night, at long tables with plates I never touch. And the more I have, the emptier I feel." His voice broke. He was no longer the business titan. He was simply a broken man. The girl took a deep breath as if weighing these confessions. Then she replied simply, "Maybe because you've forgotten how to share." The billionaire shuddered. She was right. He had spent years accumulating, hoarding, and defending what he had earned. But he had forgotten the most human gesture: sharing. He discreetly wiped away the tears, but he couldn't hide the pain in his expression. He was naked before her, more vulnerable than he had ever been in any negotiation. There, in the middle of the street, there was no contract, no status, just two wounded souls recognizing in each other the same mark: lack. Silence enveloped them both again, but it wasn't empty. It was charged with truth. The billionaire felt that, by revealing his pain, he had opened a door. Perhaps for the first time in years, he was no longer alone, because that girl understood. And understanding, in that moment, was worth more than any fortune. And so, under the cold light of the street lamp, the wound was exposed. Not to humiliate him, but to free him. Because only when he revealed his hidden hunger did the billionaire realize. Perhaps the cure lay not in what he could give the girl, but in what she could give back to him: the memory of being human again. The billionaire remained seated next to the girl, sharing the silence of the night, when flashes began to appear. At first discreet, then insistent. Paparazzi, drawn to the unusual scene, captured every detail. The most powerful man in the city sitting on the ground with a poor child. In seconds, the street transformed into a spectacle. A few passers-by stopped to watch. Some laughed, others filmed with their cell phones. "It must be propaganda," muttered one. "He just wants to look good," commented another. The billionaire listened to every word, and each one was like a thorn. No matter what he did, judgment came swiftly, cruelly, as always. The girl noticed the stares and cringed, trying to protect her crumbs and what little dignity she had left. The man sensed the discomfort and felt anger rise within him, for the first time not against the press, but against the way society preferred to mock rather than understand. A journalist approached, microphone in hand. "Sir, is this part of some social project? Is it marketing? A new image campaign?" The billionaire stared at him in silence, unable to answer. How could he explain that this wasn't advertising, but a genuine, intimate moment that shouldn't have an audience? The girl, irritated, intervened. "He's not doing anything to you, he's just here." Her firm voice surprised the reporters. Small but brave, she stood like a miniature wall, defending the man who, until yesterday, had been a stranger. The billionaire looked at her gratefully, feeling he was no longer alone. But the trials didn't stop. Headlines were already circulating online. Billionaire feigns compassion on poor street. Calculated action or real change. His image, carefully constructed over the years, was beginning to distort before his eyes. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. He felt the weight of his reputation crumble. Inside, he fought the urge to run away, to return to the comfort of the mansion and erase that scene. But something held him there. The girl, with her silent presence, reminded him that truth needs neither applause nor approval, only courage. "Let them speak," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "They don't know what we know." The billionaire took a deep breath and nodded. It was strange. He, accustomed to controlling everything, was now guided by the words of a child. And somehow, it felt right. As the photographers clicked non-stop, the man realized this was the first time in years he hadn't worried about looking strong. If his image was destroyed, so be it. Because deep down, he understood. That night wasn't about how the world saw him, but about how he finally saw himself. And so, under the city's ravenous gaze, the billionaire and the girl remained together, judged, criticized, misunderstood. But between them lay a truth no one could steal, that even in opposite worlds, they had found each other. And this encounter was already changing everything. The next morning, the image of the billionaire sitting next to the girl was all over the newspapers, websites, and social media. Headlines screamed scandals, analyses, and jokes. Some called him a hypocrite, others an unlikely saint. But most saw it as a cheap marketing ploy. His reputation, built over decades, was in flames. Upon arriving at his company's headquarters, he found the partners and advisors gathered in a luxurious room. The atmosphere was tense, their gazes hard. One of them got straight to the point. "What you did yesterday was a disaster. The stock dropped 4% in just a few hours. We need an immediate strategy to clean up your image." The billionaire remained silent, staring out the glass window that revealed the city below. Voices overlapped, each more aggressive than the last. "You can't afford to appear weak. Our investors are furious. The headlines are destroying us." He heard it all, but his mind was still on the girl and her words. Another partner, more vitriolic, pounded the table. "If you want to play street hero, do it away from the company. Here, we deal with numbers, not emotions." The room fell silent for a moment. The billionaire felt the weight of each sentence, but also a growing anger. How could they be so blind to what really mattered? He finally spoke, his voice firm. "You saw a stock crash. I saw a child inventing banquets to survive. Tell me, what's more important?" Silence returned, but this time filled with disbelief. The partners didn't recognize this man. He didn't speak like the usual ruthless tycoon, but like someone transformed. "You're getting carried away by sentimentality," one of them accused. "Don't forget, we have contracts, commitments, responsibilities." The billionaire replied without hesitation. "And responsibility isn't just for those with money in their pockets. It's also for those with nothing on their plate." His words echoed through the room like thunder. The partners exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some snorted, others shook their heads. "If you keep this up, you'll ruin us," said one. "Or maybe save us," he retorted, surprising everyone. For the first time, he believed what he was saying, without calculating the impact, without thinking about profits. Simply speaking the truth he felt in his heart. The arguments continued for hours, each argument more bitter than the last. But deep down, the billionaire had already made his decision. He could no longer live torn between the empire he had built and the truth he had just discovered. Something had to change, not just in his life, but in the world around him. When the meeting ended, he left the room with firm steps. The partners remained behind, murmuring concerns and containment strategies. He, however, carried only one certainty. He would not let the fear of losing his fortune erase the chance to gain purpose. And so, even under pressure from all sides, the billionaire felt a new strength within himself. The girl's voice echoed in his mind. "I don't want handouts. I want dignity." And he knew he could no longer ignore it, because dignity wasn't just hers, it was his too, and it was time to reclaim it. Night fell, but the billionaire couldn't sleep. He walked alone through his silent mansion, feeling the weight of his partner's voices still echoing. On one side, the security of $1 billion empire. On the other, the memory of a little girl who smiled with Crumbs. It was as if he were torn between two worlds that could not coexist. He sat before the unlit fireplace, the non-existent fire reflecting the emptiness within him. On the table beside him, million-dollar contracts awaited his signature. Each sheet represented power, prestige, and stability. But, at the forefront of his mind, the image of the girl's fragile table, with crumbs arranged like banquets, loomed. Two scenarios, two destinies. He picked up one of the gold pens he always used to close deals. He held it tightly, but realized his hands were shaking. "Everything I've gained is here," he thought. But immediately another inner voice countered. "And everything you've lost, too." It was like a silent battle between the man the world knew and the human being trying to be reborn. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the girl pushing the money back, refusing alms. He saw his mother saying, "Hunger teaches more than any school." The memories intertwined, forming an emotional labyrinth with no way out. He knew he could no longer live as before, but he also knew the decision would come at a price. If he chose to follow his heart, he would lose partners, contracts, perhaps even his fortune. He would be called crazy, naive, a man who squandered everything on a whim. But if he chose to keep the empire, he would have to erase the girl's memory, and that thought hurt more than any bankruptcy. He walked to the mansion's window. The city glowed with artificial lights, as if to disguise its own shadows. What's the point of lighting the world with glass buildings if there are still children hiding in the dark? He thought. The question burned in his mind like fire. He sat back down, taking a deep breath, and spoke to himself quietly. I must choose. The phrase echoed through the empty room like a sentence. He knew there was no more room for half measures. The time for hiding behind wealth was over. Life demanded a clear stance from him now. He picked up a contract and stared at it. A deal worth billions. All it took was a signature. But instead of a pen, his hand trembled as if holding an unbearable weight. The document felt more like a chain than an opportunity. For the first time, he saw no profit in the figures, only imprisonment. The tears fell quietly. They weren't tears of weakness, but of liberation. He knew, deep down, what the right choice was. He just feared what would come next. But he remembered the girl sharing bread with the stray dog. If she could share even a little, why couldn't he risk losing so much? And so, before the contract table and the unlit fireplace, the billionaire made the decision that would change his life forever. He didn't yet know how or when, but he knew what. He would no longer live to accumulate. He would live to transform. And this path would begin with a choice that frightened the world but freed his soul. The next morning, the billionaire called a press conference at his own company. The room was packed, journalists, cameras, incessant flashes. Everyone expected an explanation for the scandal of the night with the girl, but no one imagined what he was about to announce. Wearing a simple suit without the usual pomp, he took the stage and looked out at the crowd. For a few seconds, silence fell. Then, his voice rang out firmly. For years, I accumulated wealth, believing that this was true power. But last night, a child showed me that real power lies not in hoarding, but in sharing. The journalists looked at each other, confused. He continued, "From today on, I will no longer invest in businesses that waste while others go hungry. I will break contracts with, companies that throw away tons of food. And I'm announcing a new project, transforming waste into food for those in need." The words fell like bombs in the room. The partners in the audience shifted nervously, exchanging indignant glances. Some were already frantically typing messages on their cell phones. But the billionaire didn't hesitate. His heart, previously divided, now knew exactly where to beat. He held up a sheet of paper to the cameras. "Here are contracts worth billions. Today I destroy them." He tore the sheets apart one by one, amidst the incessant flashes. The crisp sound of the paper being ripped echoed like thunder. It was the end of an era and the beginning of another. Outside, the news spread in real time. Some called it madness, others courage. Many scoffed, but a few were already beginning to applaud. For the first time in years, the billionaire wasn't concerned with opinions. What mattered was that inside him, something was being reborn. He closed the press conference with a simple phrase, "I've learned that a piece of bread shared is worth more than feasts wasted." Then he walked off the stage without answering any questions, leaving journalists stunned and his associates furious. But his mind was already elsewhere. He was on the street with the girl. That night, he returned to the same place where it all began. The makeshift table was still there, rickety, supporting scraps of bread. The girl waited for him, wary but curious. He sat beside her just like the first time. But this time he brought with him not just bread, but a plan. "Something new has begun today," he said, "and I want you to be a part of it." The girl arched her eyebrow in surprise. "Part of what?" He smiled. "A project that will transform the world's scraps into real feasts." There was no hesitation in his eyes, only conviction. And in that moment, under the dim light of a streetlight, the billionaire's life turned around. The shift wasn't just financial, but spiritual. He had gone from being a prisoner of numbers to becoming the apprentice of a girl who knew how to turn nothing into everything. A few weeks later, a grand charity dinner was held in the city's most luxurious hall. The event brought together politicians, business people, and celebrities, all curious to see if the billionaire had truly lost his mind, or if there was a plan behind his actions. The hall gleamed. In gold, crystal chandeliers reflecting the excess. In the center, a huge table was set with silver plates and crystal glasses. But this time there were no expensive wines or extravagant dishes. Instead, there were simple breads, fresh fruit, and heaping bowls of rice and beans. The contrast made many guests uncomfortable. It was as if abundance were present, but without unnecessary luxury. The billionaire took the makeshift stage. Behind him, a large screen displayed images of tons of food wasted daily throughout the city. The guests murmured, some laughed, others fell silent. He took a deep breath and said, "For years I thought wealth was having more than I needed. Today I know that true wealth is ensuring that no one goes without." Then he beckoned and the door opened. The girl entered, shy but firm, holding a small loaf of bread in her hands. The entire room turned its gaze to her. Some looked at her with disdain, others with curiosity. But the billionaire smiled proudly and introduced her. "This is my teacher of abundance. She was the one who showed me that even crumbs can be a feast." Silence fell over the room. The guests didn't know how to react. The girl, in her simplicity, walked to the table and broke the bread into pieces, distributing them to those nearby. "This is how it begins," she said. Her voice was fragile, but it carried a truth that no flowery speech could convey. Flashes flashed, cameras recorded every gesture. And there, before the city's elite, the billionaire made it clear that his transformation wasn't a performance. It was a commitment. He declared that all his wealth would now be devoted to a project that would collect wasted food and deliver it to the hungry. Some guests applauded timidly. Others, irritated, got up and left, muttering that it was madness. But among those who remained, something began to change. The gesture of the girl breaking the bread seemed too symbolic to ignore. It was as if a new consciousness had been planted in that crystal hall. The billionaire, overcome with emotion, concluded, "We're not here to appear generous, but to be human. Anyone who wants to join me will have to leave the excess outside and bring only the desire to share." His words echoed, cutting through the heavy air of the room. The girl looked at him and smiled. For the first time, there was no distrust in her eyes. There was hope. And in that smile, the billionaire understood. It wasn't just him who had changed. The world could change too, starting with that moment. And so, in the heart of a hall accustomed to luxury, the simplest gesture, a broken and divided loaf, became a revolution. It was the climax of the journey, the moment when crumbs became symbols, and where a child and a broken man showed the city that abundance begins with the act of sharing. Days after the charity dinner, the city began to change in unexpected ways. Restaurants that had previously thrown away entire trays of food began donating surplus food. Bakeries separated stale bread for distribution. Inspired small businesses set up makeshift collection points. The billionaire's gesture had become a real movement. The girl, once invisible, now walked the streets with a different sparkle in her eyes. She no longer needed to concoct banquets of crumbs. Children who had previously gathered around her in silence now laughed, holding full plates. It was as if dignity that his mother had taught him finally materialized before his eyes. The billionaire closely monitored every action. He didn't delegate everything to executives. He was present, carrying boxes, delivering meals, looking people in the eye. This caused surprise in many, but also respect. He was no longer just a name in the headlines. He was a real man, living the transformation he preached. His former partners called him insane, accusing him of destroying their fortune. But ironically, new investors began to emerge, interested not in immediate profit, but in social impact. What had seemed madness was beginning to be seen as the future. The Crumb Company, as they called it, was growing faster than any other business he had ever owned. For the girl, the greatest justice wasn't found in money, but in the eyes of the other children. They no longer saw her as the one who plays with crumbs, but as someone who paved the way for them. The story of her makeshift table spread, becoming a symbol of resistance and hope. One day, passing the same corner where it all began, she stopped before the old broken table. She touched the worn wood and smiled. "You were my first banquet," she murmured, as if speaking to an old friend. The billionaire beside her understood the weight of that memory. It was the mark of the past, but also proof of her victory. The movement reached the international press. Headlines no longer spoke of cheap propaganda, but of a new model of social dignity. Photos of the girl and the billionaire sharing bread spread around the world, transforming them into unlikely symbols of a quiet revolution. And for the first time in decades, the man who had built financial empires didn't feel empty. On the contrary, he felt fulfilled, because in sharing, he had discovered that he had never truly owned anything. And now, in sharing, he finally felt that everything truly belonged to him. The girl, in her simplicity, sought neither fame nor recognition. For her, it was enough to see people smiling around a lavish table. But deep down, she knew she was living the justice her mother had always promised her. One day, the empty plate would become a royal feast. And so, the city that once turned its face away now learned to look. The table of dignity expanded, and the echo of a girl who pretended to eat crumbs as a banquet now resounded as truth. No one should have to pretend to survive. The sun rose over the transformed city. Streets that once ignored the hungry now housed points of sharing. Makeshift tables multiplied, no longer for the pretense of banquets, but for offering real meals. And at the heart of this silent revolution were two unlikely characters, a girl who dreamed of scraps and a billionaire who learned to share. In a central square, hundreds of people gathered around long tables. The food was simple but plentiful. Laughter echoed, children ran, families hugged. The billionaire and the girl walked among them, not as celebrities, but as part of the crowd. There were no rich or poor, just humans. He knelt before a group of children and handed them full plates. The smile he received in return was bigger than any number he'd ever seen in his bank accounts. The girl watched him with pride. Strange as it was, she knew. She had transformed this man, and in return, he had transformed the world around him. Later, as they walked away, the billionaire asked, "Do you still feast on your imagination?" The girl laughed, holding his hand tightly. "I don't need it anymore. Now I really have it." Her laughter echoed like music, and in that instant he realized his mission was just beginning, but the first miracle had already happened. Sometimes it's on the emptiest plate that we find the truest feast. Sometimes it's in the hardest heart that the most powerful change is born. Because abundance isn't about having a lot, it's about having enough to share. Silence returns, not as absence, but as plenitude. The viewer feels the story has come to an end, but the message continues to resonate. Because deep down, we all carry within us the power to transform crumbs into feasts, as long as we choose to share. And you? What would you do if you were in his place? Would you share your crumbs or continue to live off wasted feasts? Think about it. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment, share it with someone special, and subscribe to the channel. This way, you'll help spread more stories of hope and transformation.